Hello. All right, let me just review the syllabus with you guys. So that we can be clear about what we're going to be discussing tomorrow and Thursday when we start the Marx. Okay, so you'll see that the page numbers correspond to the Marx Engels reader, and there's a PDF of that in the folder in the files on Canvas. So the two short pieces for tomorrow are to make the world philosophical and for a ruthless criticism of everything existing. Then we're going to read about 30 pages from the selections in the Marx Engels reader from the 1844 manuscripts, the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. So for ruthless criticism of everything existing, it's very clear. To make the world philosophical is going to be a little opaque. It's selections from Marx's dissertation. There's a lot of kind of philosophical and poetic language and classical mythological references. So it's going to be a little bit, it's just 2 pages you'll see, but it'll be a little opaque. The 1844 manuscripts are also a little opaque because they're notes for a book that he never finished writing, so not published until posthumously, until the 20th century. So these readings will be a little bit challenging, but don't be discouraged. We'll go through them in detail. As I mentioned, tomorrow, Tuesday this week, we're going to have an abbreviated class session. So we'll start early. We'll start at 6:30 and we'll end at 7:30. We'll do that one more time, and that's August 8th, before the end of the course. Unfortunately, my apologies, because I have another conflicting teaching obligation every other Tuesday during the summer. So I'm making them start late and have an abbreviated class because the 2 classes are on top of each other. Thursday, similarly, we'll be reading, the long reading will be the Communist Manifesto, and then we'll have 2 short readings, very short. One is just a paragraph and the other is a couple of pages long. The Coming Upheaval and Class Struggle and Motive Production. And again, those are all in the Marx Engels reader. So that will kind of get us going on Marx. We'll have a full week of Marx next week, where we'll be reading selections from Das Kapital, from Capital, and from the Grundrisse. Okay. Today, I hope the page selections from the Hegel were not unclear. The Hackett edition, which I've recommended, it would just have been all of the readings in the Hackett edition. But short of that, the PDF that we have on Canvas for the Hegel, for the Introduction to the Philosophy of History, it's the entire Introduction to the Philosophy of History. So it's a long book. We're only reading the introduction. We're only reading the first part of it. And so it was page 14 to 96, or alternatively 14 to 128, because we'll look at a little bit at those 30 pages after page 96. We'll also make reference to that, but the latter bit was more supplemental. So the core reading is from page 14 to 96 in the PDF that we have on Canvas. And I'll bring that up now, in fact. I noticed that no one posted any notes. For some reason, no one posted any notes.
I did post notes. Did I post it in the wrong place?
You might have. So it's week 7. Let's see. Oh, now there are. Okay, they must have been posted very recently. Okay, good. All right, great. Oh, excellent. Okay. Cassia and Jacqueline. Okay, great. Okay, good. Those must have come in the last, like, half an hour or something. Great. I appreciate that. Okay, I see now. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to press submit.
No, that's okay. That's fine. As long as we have them now, it's good. All right, so I wanted to just talk a little bit about Hegel before we get into the reading. So Hegel, a famous philosopher, we ended last week with Benjamin Constant and Immanuel Kant. So Benjamin Constant, his piece on the liberty of the ancients compared with that of the moderns, is roughly contemporaneous with Hegel's mature writing, from which the Introduction to the Philosophy of History is taken. I think that Hegel was giving these lectures, though, before the defeat of Napoleon, whereas Benjamin Constant was writing after the defeat of Napoleon. So that's a significant historical difference, although I might not be right about that. Let me see when this was published. Because this is a course that he gave many times, and then we'd have the student notes compiled by for posterity later on. But I wanted to say something about Hegel and Kant, the relationship between Hegel and Kant in particular. So Kant, in his critical philosophy, in his critical turn in philosophy, Hegel narrated this in retrospect as the beginning of philosophy. So there's this idea that Kant began philosophy, kind of restarted philosophy on a new foundation, began philosophy with his critical turn, and then Hegel claimed to have completed philosophy. So Kant began it, and Hegel completed it. And so this is known in the history of philosophy as the 25 years of philosophy. So 25 years of philosophy, Kant begins it, Hegel completes it and ends it in a certain respect. So what does that mean? Especially given the fact that, as Robert Pippin pointed out, Hegel is much more associated with, much more explicitly about historicizing philosophy. Kant also historicized philosophy, but Hegel much more explicitly so, much more thematically so. Apart from the Introduction to the Philosophy of History, Hegel also gave lectures on the introduction to the history of philosophy. Okay, so what's meant here about the 25 years of philosophy? Well, first of all, traditional philosophy, ancient philosophy, versus modern philosophy. So modern philosophy begins with Kant and is completed by Hegel. Now, I mention all of this, and I emphasize this, because, in fact, Marxism agreed with this. Marx and Engels agreed with this assessment. So what did Hegel mean by ending philosophy or completing philosophy? What he meant was that he had completed the formal system of philosophy. He had completed the formal analysis and explication of philosophy as such, philosophy as such, and that after that, and this gets to the reading that we'll have tomorrow night from Marx, since the world had become philosophical, philosophy had become worldly, namely, philosophy was now going to be conducted by people reflecting in their everyday life on their practices and self-critically reflecting on their theory of things, their conceptual understanding of things. So philosophy was going to permeate the world, permeate reality in practice, such that a separate discipline of philosophy would become redundant. So no more formalization of philosophy would be required after Hegel. He thought. Okay, so, and again, if you recall, Kant also was inspired by Rousseau to consider philosophy's mission to be the explanation of common sense, and that philosophers might have a specialized training, might have the kind of technical knowledge and language, facility with language, to analyze and explain things formally, but that this didn't make philosophers more insightful or intelligent than the average day laborer, so namely everyone. So everyone's a philosopher, and that means that no one has to be a philosopher. No one has to be. So if they are, they're only philosophers in a specialized formal sense, in a technical sense, not in a substantial sense. In a substantial sense, everyone's a philosopher. Well, we're going to see how Marx will find a new problem after Hegel. So he's in the generation, he's not in the immediate generation, he's in a kind of subsequent generation after Hegel. And if you recall from the first day of class, we read Louis Menand on Marx and Engels as the philosophers of a second enlightenment. So the question is, why would a second enlightenment be necessary? So wasn't the bourgeois enlightenment good enough? Well, for Hegel, it was. But for Marx, it is not, because capitalism develops a new problem that requires a new approach, a new enlightenment, and requires something other than philosophy. So it doesn't require a new philosophy. Marxism isn't a new philosophy. So that's why Marx agreed philosophy was completed by Hegel. But requires something else. It's what the Frankfurt School, it's what Horkheimer called and Adorno called, and Marcuse, critical theory. Critical theory, rather than philosophy. Okay. Now, another way of getting at this is that the highest philosophy of freedom, to use that catchphrase from the title of Horkheimer's aphorism on the first day of class, The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom, Kant, Hegel, bourgeois philosophy more generally, had not been surpassed, has not been surpassed in the philosophy of freedom. However, that philosophy of freedom, that bourgeois philosophy of freedom, that modern critical philosophy of freedom, might require some further clarification, as Horkheimer put it. Clarification about what? About capitalism. But capitalism doesn't require a new philosophy. It might require a critical theory. So I say all of this because Hegel is associated, especially in the reading that we're doing, the philosophy of history, Hegel is associated with the end of history, the idea of an end of history, by which he meant a telos, or a goal of history, in the way that Kant discussed in the idea for universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view. So what would an end of history be? What would it mean? It would mean achieving the highest form of freedom. So bourgeois emancipation is the highest form of freedom. At least for Hegel. Why? Well, of course, for Hegel, as for Kant, bourgeois freedom was still a task. Bourgeois emancipation was still a task. It wasn't fully realized, and anyway, Kant said that fully realizing bourgeois freedom in a political state of a global civil society and a world state or system of states to guarantee the freedom of that civil society, that would mark the mere midway point, halfway mark of human history, of freedom. So it was an open-ended project. However, Hegel could say that in his own time, a certain kind of history was being completed or realized, fulfilled. And that would be bourgeois history. That would be bourgeois philosophy. That would be bourgeois society. Now, I want to say something about this because he's going to talk about civil society. And civil society is bürgerliche society. It is bourgeois society in German. That's the term that's used. Civil society. And Marx is also going to talk about civil society and bourgeois society. And what's meant by this is not just the period after the Renaissance. Certainly, the period after the Renaissance initiates its fulfillment, its completion, its attainment. However, it has a history reaching back before that. Meaning bourgeois emancipation, bourgeois freedom, emancipation from traditional civilization, bourgeois freedom, had a prehistory, we might say, or had an antecedent history. Had a history leading up to it. It didn't come out of nowhere in the Renaissance. It drew on ancient and even medieval roots. This is what Hegel's going to try to explain in his introduction to the philosophy of history. So you could say bourgeois society started in the ancient Mediterranean world. It started in Athens and Rome. And it continued through the Middle Ages and then began to fulfill itself starting in the Renaissance or in the late medieval era. That's when the Renaissance city-states arise, is in the late Middle Ages. Okay, so we're not just talking about periods of time. We're not just talking about points on a line of history. We're talking about a historical process, a long historical process. We could also say bourgeois society, bourgeois emancipation, bourgeois consciousness began in classical antiquity in a certain way. Now, I mentioned in our last class when we were talking about Kant and philosophy, that philosophy is something seen in all classical civilizations everywhere. It's seen in Africa, Asia, Europe. Less clear that there's a record of this in the Western Hemisphere with the civilizations at the time of Columbian contact, the Incas and the Aztecs. But philosophy had emerged out of theology. It had distinguished itself from theology. In the West, in the ancient Mediterranean world that gave birth to European civilization, in classical antiquity, in ancient Athens, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And of course, they don't come out of nowhere either. There are pre-Socratic philosophers. Pre-Socratic philosophers whose works are sometimes difficult to distinguish from science, empirical observations, science in the way that we mean it as modern people, or even art, because they're written in verse. They're poems. So pre-Socratic philosophy is poetry as well as science. It's art as well as science. It's literary as well as empirical. Philosophy per se, however, is the creation of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Above all, Aristotle. Aristotle, who was suppressed in some ways during the Middle Ages, remembered in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, he's simply referred to Aristotle as the philosopher. The Arabic word for Aristotle, the name for Aristotle, is just the philosopher. And there's some connection between philosophy and bourgeois society, therefore. And we can even say bourgeois society, urban society, the town folk. There's something about the city, including the ancient city-states, Athens, Rome, that give birth to this kind of consciousness, this kind of enlightenment, because they give birth to social relations. So there's a long history of bourgeois social relations, there's a long history of bourgeois consciousness. And that is part of what Hegel is going to try to lay out here. Okay, so let me say some other things. So telos, teleology, teleological view of history, universal history, the idea for universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view. Kant. I mentioned this at last class. The idea is that we're looking back on the past from the standpoint of the present and thinking about what in the past made the present possible. In this respect, we're talking about a telos not of the future, but of the present. And not as an achieved state, but as a process of becoming. Meaning, the present understood as a task. So what in the past led to the task we have in the present? What is the history of our present struggle for freedom, of our present form for emancipation, of our present form of consciousness? What's the history of that? How has the past all been leading to this? So it's not a goal towards which we're heading towards in the future. It's a task that we're struggling with in the present. It's a struggle for freedom we're engaged in right now. Right, so it isn't like the world is inevitably headed to some point in the future. It's rather, what are we struggling for now? And therefore, how does the past look to us from the standpoint of our struggle for freedom in the present? How do we find resources, precedents, antecedents for what we are struggling for now? That's really the issue. And the time between Kant and Hegel on the one hand, the 25 years of philosophy, and Marx on the other hand, who we will be starting to read tomorrow, a crucial development takes place between Kant and Hegel's time and Marx's time, between Benjamin Constant's time and Marx's time, between Adam Smith's time and Marx's time, between Rousseau's time and Marx's time. And that's capitalism. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is what happens. But we'll get there. I'm just sort of flagging this now because Hegel is not going to describe capitalism. He is going to describe bourgeois society, but he's not going to describe capitalism. Because, in fact, it wasn't a manifest reality yet. So this is the first Enlightenment still. It's the bourgeois Enlightenment. It's the bourgeois consciousness of freedom. It's bourgeois philosophy. It's the consciousness and the philosophy of the bourgeois revolution. So we read, again, Benjamin Constant in the aftermath of the French Revolution. The French Revolution is also very formative for Hegel. So Hegel, as a young man, he's living in the time of the French Revolution and the French Revolutionary Wars in particular. His first academic appointment was in Jena, in Germany. He's a young professor. He's there when Napoleon defeats Germany. So the Battle of Jena, that's when Napoleon defeats Prussia defeats Germany, and he sees Napoleon at the head of French troops marching through Jena. He celebrates this with his students. Celebrates the victory of Napoleon over his own country, because it means the revolution. It means the coming of the revolution. This is where he famously describes Napoleon as history on horseback. He writes a very enthusiastic letter to a friend of his. He said, I had the rare opportunity to glimpse the world soul Napoleon as he rode his horse through town at the head of his victorious army. He's writing these introductory lectures on the philosophy of history later than that, after that. And after certain things have taken place. After Napoleon is crowned emperor. And after there are national revolts against Napoleonic rule, including in Germany. And we'll see how Hegel makes sense of those things, at least cursorily, as he mentions them in the reading that we did for tonight. And what else do I want to say about Hegel? Well, okay, so it's 2025. We're living, to my mind, in a post-postmodernist era. Postmodernism was very much geared against Hegel, against Hegelianism, and really against Marxism. So it was against the Hegelian roots of Marxism. And that's a complicated story. It has to do with the predominance in French intellectual life after World War II of the Communist Party under Stalinist influence. So there's a kind of rebellion against that, and that's what leads to postmodernism. And the postmodernists rebel against historical determinism and against grand narratives of history, against historical teleology, which they regard as ideological and affirmative rather than critical in character. They had a point. They had a point against how Marxism had become an ideology, and how Marxism, in becoming an ideology in the 20th century, had a character of Hegelianism to it. They had a kind of misdirected target, though, I would say. So let me say one more thing about this, because it will come out a little bit in Marx. We're not going to spend very much time on it, but it's something that you guys should know about, which is that Marx is part of a cohort of thinkers who are known as the young Hegelians, and they are opposed to and by what is known as the old Hegelians. A different way of putting it is right Hegelians and left Hegelians. So the old Hegelians were the right Hegelians, the young Hegelians were the left Hegelians. Those aren't actually synonymous terms, but sometimes they are used synonymously. They actually do refer to slightly different things, but often this is the way it's glossed. Right Hegelianism, or old Hegelianism, is really about resolving Hegel as a conservative thinker and also as a Christian theological thinker. The young Hegelians and the left Hegelians object to this after Hegel's death, this kind of domestication and institutionalization of Hegel as a Christian conservative thinker, especially in official Prussian academic life, but also in the broader intellectual culture of Germany, and also elsewhere. Hegel's influential outside of Germany, very influential. But he has a double influence. He has a conservative influence, he has a kind of right-wing influence, and then he has a left-wing influence. And that is young Hegelianism. Marx and Engels are part of that young Hegelianism. Now, Hegel himself, in certain respects, in his own writing, he's a kind of conservative. But also in another respect, at the level of his thinking, at the level of the importance of his ideas, he's a radical, he's a revolutionary. So Hegel necessarily, according to Marx, in retrospect, Hegel seems very ambivalent. He could be seen as a conservative affirmer of the status quo, or he could be seen as a radical revolutionary calling for overthrowing the status quo. Of course, this is the dialectic in Hegel's own work. But Marx is part of what's known as the disintegration of Hegelianism, and this is something that we will read directly about when we get to Karl Korsch and his essay on Marxism and philosophy in a couple of weeks. All right, so Hegel is the last of the readings that we're doing from Marx's bookshelf, we might say. It's the last of the readings that we're doing of a selection of thinkers influential on Marx. The last of the bourgeois philosophers that we're reading. He is a thinker of the French Revolution and of the American and French Revolution. That period of revolution in the late 1700s into the early 1800s. As Karl Korsch will call him, he's a philosopher of revolution. The question is, what does that mean? How does that actually get expressed? How is it formulated in Hegel's own philosophy? As an attempt at a critical self-consciousness of the French Revolutionary moment, critical in the Kantian sense of thinking what made the French Revolution possible, what made it necessary, but also what are its possibilities beyond itself. So thinking the French Revolution, its own conditions of possibility, but it's pointing beyond itself to its own self-overcoming. Constant, if you recall from last week, also has that approach to the French Revolution, meaning that the French Revolution was conducted under a certain consciousness, a consciousness of classical antiquity and of the Renaissance, of ancient democracy, political liberty, an ancient conception of freedom, direct participatory democracy on the part of the citizens. But in fact, the French Revolution had a different content from that form of consciousness. It had a content beyond that. And that's what Constant was trying to articulate. Actually, the Jacobins, the most radical French revolutionaries, mistook the substance and content of their own revolution. But in retrospect, now we can see what the true content of it was. This is very similar to how Hegel critiqued the French Revolution and its results. Now, they're both writing in a kind of decline or reversal of the French Revolution, and yet they also think that it can't really be reversed. Meaning, in civil social life, in society itself, the revolution could not be reversed. It could be reversed at a political level in terms of the form of the state, but it couldn't be reversed in actual social substance. That emancipation could not be reversed. And in this respect, it's similar to what Kant said in What is Enlightenment: argue all you want but obey, meaning even if you don't have an autocratic, however enlightened, despotic, dictatorial, absolute monarch like Frederick the Great, still you'd have to obey. So even if you were living in a democratic republic with civil liberties, with the Bill of Rights, you're still bound to obey in certain respects. And so it's still a matter of public reason and not private reason. And public reason is based on a freedom in actual everyday practical life, or at least the potential for that freedom, that itself cannot be, at least not fully, extinguished by any political regime. So it's there regardless of the form of the state. And that's my last point. Sometimes Hegel, when he is taken up as a conservative thinker, he's accused of, like Kant, apologizing for the Prussian autocracy, for the Prussian state, for the Prussian absolute monarchy. But this is a misunderstanding. This is an unfair criticism. Of course, neither Kant nor Hegel could come out as insurrectionary against their own state, especially in their state. They did not have the freedom to do that. So what was Hegel's ideal political state? It was the British constitutional monarchy. It was the United Kingdom. So he is in favor of monarchy and not democracy because he, like Benjamin Constant, is wary of the illusions of political liberty at the expense of civil liberty. So he sees something like a constitutional monarchy as a guarantor of the freedom of society against the state, whereas democracy threatens to merge state and society, and in that way abrogate civil liberties. He's a liberal. Hegel's a liberal. That's really what he is. He's a liberal, constitutional Republican, we might say. And he thought that the greatest achieved model for that was the British monarchy. However, with a footnote, with an asterisk, and the asterisk is this. One of his students said, well, actually isn't, according to your own criteria, isn't the greatest achieved state on this basis actually not the British monarchy, but the American Democratic Republic? And Hegel said, yeah, you're right, of course. Here, we'll see in the introduction to the philosophy of history, he says he's not going to talk about America or Russia because they are the lands of the future. They're the lands of the future in a very diametrically opposed sense. So it's a kind of an arch comment by Hegel. So America is the land of the future, meaning America's already transcended European history. Russia is the land of the future because a lot is going to be determined by where Russia goes, because Russia was responsible for defeating Napoleon. Russia was responsible in certain respects for drawing a limit to the reach and the effect of the French Revolution. So America has already transcended European history. Russia represents how European history has not yet achieved itself. And that will depend on the fate of Russia. So Russia and America he leaves out of account in his history because they are the lands of the future, whereas Europe is the land of the present. And again, that gets us back to the point about the telos, the teleological character of the argument, which is that it's not really about the future, it's about the present. And he's dealing with the European present. He's dealing with the aftermath of the French Revolution, with the task of achieving bourgeois emancipation, which made huge strides through the French Revolution, but also found its limits. And Russia represents that. One could also say the British represented that. After all, it's the British who defeat Napoleon at Waterloo. It's the British who fund and equip the Europeans against the French Revolution. So it's actually the British who defeat the French Revolution, but perhaps they could not have without the Russians. All right, so that's, again, a little bit of a irony of history, we might say. And we'll see what he says about the British. He says the problem with the British is that they think they have freedom, like their private property. They think they've achieved it, and are no longer struggling for it, and because they think they've achieved it and that they have it, they've become like middle-aged men who have abandoned the dreams of their youth and are now just waiting to die. All right, so again, freedom is not something that you have. It's not a possession. It's not property. It's not a state of being. It's a task. It's a process of becoming. So, like Kant in What is Enlightenment and do we live in an enlightened age? Well, okay, here's what enlightenment is, but we do not live in an enlightened age. We live in an age of enlightenment, meaning we are not enlightened, but are in the process of becoming enlightened. Similarly, we're not free, but we're in the process of becoming free. That to say we are free means that we're free to struggle for freedom. It doesn't mean that it's an achieved state or a possession. All right, that's my introduction to Hegel. So let's now switch to the other aspect of this, which is that the title of the book in which this is published is Reason in History, which could also be called Freedom in History. But really, the subject, the topic, is not actually freedom per se. It is history. In other words, it is about something. It's about history, albeit philosophical history, which means history in a philosophical sense has to be concerned with the history of freedom, has to be concerned with consciousness of freedom. But it's also about history per se. And that's why he begins with the three kinds of history. With original history, with history proper, and then with philosophical history. So what is original history? Because what he means by history is historiography, the writing of history, consciousness of history as objectified, as formalized, as written. So original history is the record of the past that we have as a chronicle. When the past was present, how did people chronicle it in their own time? From first-hand observation, or from direct knowledge, even if not first-hand observation. So journalism, what we would now call journalism, that's the first writing of history. The first writing of history is as a chronicle of the present. It's as journalism. That's original history. History proper, the second kind of history, is retrospective history. It's usually what we mean by history, meaning it is an account of the past retrospectively, in hindsight, from a later date, from the standpoint of the present. Finally, philosophical history, what does it all mean? Meaning, history in hindsight from the standpoint of the present, but self-conscious about its true concern, which is freedom, consciousness of freedom. Or as Kant put it in the idea for universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view, when posterity, when the future looks back on the present, we will be judged in the way that we might judge the past now, which is we'll evaluate what people did to further or hinder the realization of a cosmopolitan global civil society and a world state or a world system of states that guaranteed the freedom of that civil society. So philosophical history is history looked at from the standpoint of what it all means, what it all adds up to, what it's all leading towards in the present. What it's all leading towards in the present. And the present, not just as a status quo, a state of affairs, not the present as given, as it exists, but the present as the potential and possibility for the struggle for freedom. The present as it points beyond itself. The present as it is tasked with overcoming itself, if you recall the dialectic of being and becoming that we had on the first day of class. So history, in those three different senses, journalism, chronicling, the record of the present that will become the record of the past in the future. Retrospective history, or history proper, writing about the past from the standpoint of the present, and then philosophical history, or the story of reason in history, or the story of freedom in history. Now, there is something also that I like to use to help illustrate Hegel. Let me see if I can find it here. It's a central passage. In Hegel, okay, here it is. It's in the announcements. All right, let's look at these. I'll share my screen with you guys. I'll resend this via announcements. It's an old announcement. I'll resend it. But just to sort of cut to the heart of what we're discussing with Hegel, I have three different sets of quotations. The first from W.E.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction in America, written in 1935 when Du Bois was a Marxist. He had started out as a Hegelian. He was educated to get his PhD in Germany. He started out as a Hegelian. He then later became a socialist and a Marxist. And he wrote a history of Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War in the United States, between roughly 1865 and 1876, that was defeated and gave rise instead to the Jim Crow era in the South and racist segregation after slavery. But the 10 years after the Civil War was a period of kind of radical democratic experimentation and attempts to really overcome the legacy of slavery in a profound way at a political, social, and economic level. So he's writing about that in the 30s, in the 1930s, in hindsight. And we'll see how he has a kind of a Marxist view, but he also still has very much a Hegelian view. So let's see what Du Bois has to say in Black Reconstruction in America. He says, "The most magnificent drama in the last 1,000 years of human history is the transportation of 10 million human beings out of the dark beauty of their mother continent into the newfound El Dorado of the West. They descended into hell, and in the 3rd century they arose from the dead, in the finest effort to achieve democracy for the working millions which this world had ever seen. It was a tragedy that beggared the Greek. It was an upheaval of humanity like the Reformation and the French Revolution. Yet we are blind and led by the blind. We discern in it no part of our labor movement, no part of our industrial triumph, no part of our religious experience. Before the dumb eyes of 10 generations of 10 million children, it is made mockery of and spit upon. a degradation of the eternal mother, a sneer at human effort, with aspiration and art deliberately and elaborately distorted. And why? Because in a day when the human mind aspired to a science of human action, a history and psychology of the mighty effort of the mightiest century, we fell under the leadership of those who would compromise with truth in the past in order to make peace in the present and guide policy in the future. Okay, so what is he talking about? He's talking about the triumph of a kind of redeemer history. So even though the Confederacy was defeated in the Civil War, Reconstruction also failed. It was defeated. And then the kind of white supremacists in the South rewrote the history. And there was an attempt to redeem the Confederacy, so redeemer history. And they said, well, actually, the Civil War wasn't really about slavery. It was a war of northern aggression. It was a war for southern freedom. It was a war against northern capitalism trying to take over the South. So this redeemer history, which he's arguing against, and which was pretty dominant for many decades, not only in the South but in the North. It started to be reversed in the 1930s, in the 1920s and 30s, after World War I. But it really had a very powerful influence, this redeemer history, this viewpoint of the past, from the standpoint of the defeat of Reconstruction. So what Du Bois is doing is instead saying, well, in fact, no, we should remember this history differently. We shouldn't remember it as an era of corruption. That's the way Reconstruction was talked about. Ulysses S. Grant, his presidency, he was vilified as a corrupt president who was drunk, etc., and who lost control of the South to the carpetbaggers and, the northern capitalists who were just trying to take advantage of black people and use them against the good white people of the South in order to take over in the name of northern capitalism. That was the dominant narrative. The narrative was it wasn't really about slavery, it was about northern capitalism taking over the South. Du Bois is arguing against that. And he's saying it reaches back even beyond the story of Reconstruction. It reaches back to how one sees slavery itself. So notice slavery, which is one of the greatest atrocities in human history, the transatlantic African slave trade. He sees it rather differently. He sees it as an opportunity, meaning, what did this create? It created a black population in the United States, which became a force for democracy and freedom. So it's a very peculiar way of thinking about it. How did this history of atrocity and horror nonetheless give rise to a possibility for the struggle for freedom? So where does he get this attitude about history from? Well, of course, from Hegel. So let's see what Hegel has to say. This is from the reading we did for tonight. When we look at this drama of human passions and observe the consequences of their violence and of the unreason that is linked not only to them, but also and especially to good intentions and rightful aims, when we see arising from them all the evil, the wickedness, the decline of the most flourishing nations mankind has produced, we can only be filled with grief for all that has come to nothing. And since this decline and fall is not merely the work of nature, but of the will of men, we might well end with moral outrage over such a drama, and with revolt of our good spirit, if there is a spirit of goodness in us. Without rhetorical exaggeration, we could paint the most fearful picture of the misfortunes suffered by the noblest of nations and states, as well as by private virtues. And with that picture we could arouse feelings of the deepest and most helpless sadness, not to be outweighed by any consoling outcome. We can strengthen ourselves against this, or escape it, only by thinking that, well, so it was at one time, it is fate, there is nothing to be done about it now. And finally, in order to cast off the tediousness that this reflection of sadness could produce in us, and to return to involvement in our own life, to the present of our own aims and interests. We return to the selfishness of standing on a quiet shore where we can be secure in enjoying the distant sight of confusion and wreckage. But as we contemplate history as the slaughter bench, upon which the happiness of nations, the wisdom of states, and the virtues of individuals were sacrificed, the question necessarily comes to mind: what was the ultimate goal for which these monstrous sacrifices were made? World history is the progress in the consciousness of freedom, a progress that we must come to know in its necessity. The Orientals knew only that one person is free, the Greeks and Romans that some are free, while we moderns know that all humans are implicitly free, qua human. The final goal of the world, we said, is spirit's consciousness of its freedom, and hence also the actualization of that very freedom. It is this final goal, freedom, towards which all the world's history has been working. It is this goal to which all the sacrifices have been brought upon the broad altar of the earth in the long flow of time. Okay. Now, what does he mean by the Orientals? He means the eastern part of the ancient Mediterranean world. So he means the ancient Persians, Babylonians, Egyptians. What does he mean by only one person is free? He means the pharaoh. He means in ancient Egypt, there's only one person who's free, and that's the emperor. That's the god emperor. The Greeks and the Romans, that some are free, meaning the citizens, a tiny portion of the population, basically the patriarchal, the men, head of household, the pater familias of the warrior caste of citizens. While we moderns, meaning bourgeois people, know that all humans are implicitly free, as human. Meaning, what does that mean? It means that we know that everyone, at least potentially, implicitly, potentially participate in the struggle for freedom. Whereas in Pharaohic Egypt, only one person is struggling for freedom, and that's the god emperor, the pharaoh. And in ancient Greece and Rome, only some are struggling for freedom, and that's the citizens. Whereas we know that everyone is part of this struggle. Because in fact, society has changed, where the action of the masses of people will determine the course of history in a way that only the action of the citizens, or only the action of the god emperors, the pharaohs, were determinative of the course of history back then. Now we know that it's in the hands of everyone to determine the course of history in its consciousness of freedom. Okay, here's a contemporary of Hegel. Thomas Jefferson, American revolutionary, author of the Declaration of Independence. Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Okay, let's see. We've got two quotations by him that speak to the French Revolutionary moment, also the moment in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution. So Jefferson was ambassador to France in the early years of the American Republic, during the American Revolution, and in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution. So he's responding to the Shays Rebellion, which takes place right when the Constitution is being formalized and being circulated for ratification. Writes back from Paris about the government, the U.S. government, putting down this rebellion that took place. It says the people cannot be all and always well informed. The part which is wrong will be discontented in proportion to the importance of the facts that they misconceive. If they remain quiet under such misconceptions, it is a lethargy, the forerunner of death to the public liberty. And what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the right of the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. The remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon and pacify them. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Okay, so he's against the Shays rebellion. He thinks that they're misconceiving things, they're ill-informed as to the facts, but he thinks still the rebellion is a good sign. It's a good sign. It's a warning to the government, and it's an assertion of the people's liberty, even if wrongly conceived. So the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Okay. Several years later, he's back in the United States. He's Secretary of State, and he's writing to the ambassador to France, William Short, who is there during the Jacobin Terror, during the kind of high, most radical, kind of dramatic moment of the French Revolution, 1793 and 1794. So here's Jefferson. He says, "The tone of your letters had for some time given me pain, on account of the extreme warmth with which they censured the proceedings of the Jacobins of France. In the struggle which was necessary, many guilty persons fell without forms of trial, and with them some innocent. These I deplore as much as anybody, and shall deplore some of them to the day of my death. But I deplore them as I should have done had they fallen in battle. It was necessary to use the arm of the people, a machine not quite so blind as balls and bombs, but blind to a certain degree. A few of their cordial friends met at their hands the fate of enemies. But time and truth will rescue and embalm their memories, while their posterity will be enjoying that very liberty for which they would never have hesitated to offer up their lives. The liberty of the whole earth was depending on the issue of the contest. And was ever such a prize won with so little innocent blood? My own affections have been deeply wounded by some of the martyrs to this cause, but rather that it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and an Eve left in every country, and left free, it would be better than as it now is." An irony of the Jacobin terror in the French Revolution was that it was actually based on observations that they had made of the American Revolution. So they were attempting to make their revolution less violent than the American Revolution. So the American Revolution was violent because it was a revolutionary war, of course, but it was also violent in terms of popular violence, in terms of mob violence. So patriots against Tories. So a lot of people were killed by revolutionary mobs in the American Revolution. So the Jacobins wanted to take that popular mob violence and channel it into a legal process. So they wanted to put actual suspected, guilty counter-revolutionaries on trial rather than have people make accusations against each other and act on them in a kind of haphazard way. So they were actually trying to limit the amount of violence. So in the American case, they would, mobs would descend on Tories, on Tory households, usually wealthy people. They'd not only kill the head of the family, they'd kill the whole family. They'd kill all the servants. They'd kill the slaves. They'd kill everybody. Whereas in the French Revolutionary case, they were targeting like the actual people who could be accused of being threats to public safety. So the Jacobins in the Republic, in the National Assembly, formed the Committee for Public Safety. And that's how they conducted their prosecution of counter-revolutionaries during the French Revolution. So ironically enough, we now remember the French Revolution as having a lot of revolutionary violence, but in fact, that was what they did was an attempt to control the revolutionary violence because they didn't want to repeat what had occurred in the United States in terms of popular violence in the American Revolution. Okay. But the question is, again, not the violence of history, not the sacrifices of history, but the results of history. What does it all add up to? What does it all amount to? Right, that's really the issue. All right, so that's my okay, a little bit long-winded introduction to the Hegel, but let's turn to the notes now. How we're doing. We can at least start getting into the notes before we take a break. Okay, so Akasi, did you want to work us through your notes?
Sure. I will comment that I started by listening to the YouTube video that you linked.
The audiobook,
Yeah, the audiobook. And then it was good, but it was just, I had to rewind a lot and it was kind of fast. So I think I did better with just reading it. Although it was good to have heard it first. Yeah. So I started on just questioning sort of, again, maybe it's just the way that they use words then versus now. So he talks about the spirit of a person a lot, and I was just curious about what he means by the spirit exactly, like what that perception is for him. I'm assuming it's like a person's personality and just sort of the way that a person's molded by their society.
Let's unpack that a bit. Let's unpack that a bit. So, okay, so when we looked at the dialectic of being and becoming, which is also the dialectic of nature and spirit, also, you could call it the dialectic of the is and the ought, what is and what ought to be. So spirit, the dialectic of nature and spirit, this category of spirit. So spirit is Geist. It could be translated into English as either spirit or as mind. So it can also be translated as mind. So sometimes Hegel was translated into English as philosophy of spirit. Other times it was philosophy of mind. So it has to do with consciousness. But the idea is that consciousness is the product of, again, this process of becoming, this struggle for freedom, the struggle for consciousness of freedom, this emerging consciousness of freedom. So spirit is, we could say, the movement of history. It's the motivation for history. It's the driver of history. It's this process of becoming, of self-overcoming, of what exists. Now, in terms of a person, when thinking about historical personalities, so there's also some other phrases that Hegel uses. Objective spirit. He also talks about objective spirit. And indeed, Hegel will, in the history of philosophy, sometimes be categorized, and also according to his own description of things, as objective idealism, as opposed to Kant, which is subjective idealism. So Kant is about the subject, it's subjective idealism, it's idealism of our subjectivity. With Hegel, it's the idealism of objective spirit. Meaning, what is a person's motivation that may not be subjectively conscious to them, may not be deliberate to them? So it's about what's motivating them, even if they are not aware of it.
It seems like it's pretty parallel to the way that he uses reason.
Right.
And I kind of talk about that a little bit later, yeah.
That's right. Reason governs the world, reason guides the world. If we keep in mind that we've already encountered this idea of Geist, of Hegelian Geist, in Rousseau's general will. So there's the general will of society that is not reducible to our individual wills or the majority will or even the aggregate of everyone's will in society. But it is more than the sum of its parts. It transcends the aggregate. So reason develops, if you recall Kant from last class, that enlightenment and progress of reason has to be seen in the race and not in the individual. And by race he means the human race, meaning humanity as a whole. How is it progressing in its enlightenment? Rather than just the individual person. Because the individual person is just an example. The individual subjectivity is just an example of the movement of objective spirit. Right, so the idea is that we're motivated, we're guided by something that we may not be aware of, unbeknownst to us. Also, Adam Smith and Bernard Mandeville's invisible hand. Right, this is what Geist is for Hegel. This is where he gets his idea from. He gets it from the Rousseauian general will, from the invisible hand of Mandeville and Adam Smith. And it's also where Kant got his idea of the ideal. Where does the ideal come from? It comes from society, and it's reflected in individual consciousness, but it's not reducible to our individual subjective consciousness. And in that respect, it's objective. So we could say the objective character of a person, which might be different from their own awareness, certainly than their own psychology. Right, so it is about how we are members of society, we're produced by society, we're agents of society in a way that we ourselves may not be aware of subjectively. Anyway, so go ahead, Cassia.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I feel like maybe I'm belittling the Geist a little bit by just saying, oh, it's his personality, but I think I get the gist.
Well, he calls it impropria persona. He uses these terms from stage drama. Also when talking about chroniclers like Julius Caesar, these are historical actors who are themselves chronicling, and who are leaving a record of their consciousness, but maybe we can discern something else going on there than what they're aware of. The example would be, and he does use this example, but I want to, because I have talked about Napoleon already. So Napoleon might have been a narcissistic guy. He might have had a certain psychological personality. He might have been motivated at a personal subjective level by all sorts of things that are rather petty. And yet he was a historical personage. He is a historical figure. And he did represent more than himself. He did take action that had effects beyond his own personal motivation. And he was also, driven to occupy the position that he had and be in the circumstance that he was in. Like I mentioned last time, he was a Jacobin. He was a Jacobin, after all. He was a Jacobin general. So he is a French revolutionary, so he is motivated by something other than personal vanity. And yet often it looks like his empirical, concrete decisions are motivated by psychology. But he plays a role that's greater than that. And in that respect, even his own personal psychology has a greater significance than merely that of an individual human being. So in that respect, yes, also the personality, we might say. What's the role? Why did someone of this personality play the role that they did in history? Can you separate the person from the role? You can't quite separate them, but you can also distinguish these two aspects of the individual.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's a bit more, yeah. So just to move on here, my second point there was sort of just feeling out Hegel sort of seems to be against the idea of people inserting their sort of like spirit or their sort of point of view into retelling history or writing about history. And I touch on this later on a little bit, and I think I flesh out the thought a little bit more. Hegel seems very opposed to what he has spoken about, the idea of writers taking liberties with retelling history and injecting their spirit into it, although he just stated, I think I'm sort of quoting from, or what's above here, that giving a spirited account has merit to bringing the lessons of the past into the future. Maybe the issue is just making up facts or filler when recounting an event when such details are missing from the actual records, which he talks about a little bit. So I was not clear on if he was really against people writing about history in this way, or if he really valued it. It seemed like he was kind of both. And he talks about that in like the critical history section.
That's right. So, okay, so on the one hand, history is written by historians. It's historiographical. You can't write history entirely objectively. So the question is, what's the relation between the subjective and the objective character of history? Meaning, of course, the subjective concerns, consciousness, even psychology of the historian come into play. So what he's saying is, how do we evaluate history? Actually, it's a subset of how we evaluate everything. Meaning, how does the historian make use of their own personality in producing a true history? Right? How do they mobilize their own psychology? How do they utilize their own subjectivity, their own insights, in producing a more objective truth in the history that they write? And again, in that way, it's very similar to considering historical actors, meaning historical actors have to make use of their own personality in order to do the historical things that they do.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so he's trying to call attention to something, also not in an entirely new way, meaning in the 18th century, in the 1700s, and already before that, indeed. Starting in the Renaissance, there was a great deal of reflection on history, reflection on historiography, reflections on, the historical record and historians' accounts of things, and how do we make sense of them. So a lot of this is not new to Hegel, but he is putting it within this framework of, okay, what do we do with the bias of the historian? How do we make sense of it?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean? Does it mean that we're just getting a skewed account, a falsified
mm-hmm.
account, or is there a truth even in that bias?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Because it is telling us about
that person's period of time.
Yes.
Yeah.
That person's moment, and also
mm-hmm.
why that history has resonated afterwards. Why it has, why it has a future, we might say.
Mm-hmm. So I'll go on to my next point here. I quoted him, what experience in history teach is this, that people and governments never have learned anything from history or acted on principles deduced from it. And I just sort of I just commented on that. It's just like very sad that it seems to be true. I feel like
we're living through it now.
Yeah, we're living through it now. I feel like I've grown up being told to like pay attention to history and like the lessons, but like I feel caught up on this like notion that the peculiar circumstances that we're in our circumstances right now just don't line up well enough for people to take what we've learned from history and apply it right now. It's like it's
confusing.
There needs to be, there's too much thought that needs to go into it, or too much work that needs to go into it, and it's just easier, I imagine, for people to just kind of power through.
Also, we're living in a partisan divide in which both sides accuse the other of like fascism and betraying democracy and tyranny and violating freedom. And, maybe they're both right.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're both right. So a lot of it, and it's hard to separate rhetoric from substance.
Yes, especially when you're in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then while you were reading us the quotes, I thought the Jefferson quote, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants, was really, I feel like, apt right now. I feel like we're a little bit, or at least I feel a little bit stuck. Like, are we at this point where we are not working hard enough to work against a tyrant, potentially?
That's right. That's right.
But also, I think...
Who's the patriot and who's the tyrant? Meaning both sides will accuse the other of being the tyrant, and both sides will claim to be the patriots. I mean, that's why he says that it's even good for people who are wrong to revolt.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because it shows that there's some sort of
life
feeling that needs to be addressed. Yeah.
Yep.
I can't remember at what point we were talking about this, but at some point you said, when it comes to war through the ages, the amount of force needed to conquer becomes greater and greater. So it just makes it seem like we can't really use the maybe Jefferson's perspective of it's just time to riot, because I feel like we're in a very different place.
It is different. Yeah. That's right. I was talking about that in light of Benjamin Constant, because Benjamin Constant was saying that we can't accomplish by war what the ancients were able to accomplish by war.
Right, exactly, yeah. And then I'll just skip over that next point because I already talked about that. That kind of already talked about the reason thing as well. That reason is... so I think it was Rousseau we talked about earlier, spoke about logic as being the ability, the thing that we can do that makes us human, drives us to create society and work together. And then Hegel implies it's more of like a unseen, like you said, the invisible hand, sort of this energy or power, more so than like a thing that we are harnessing. So I thought that was interesting. And Rousseau is before Hegel, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So both are using the term reason, but we might say that Hegel's going even more radically into it than Rousseau did.
Yes, and more abstract. Yeah. And then I just touched on nature, and I think maybe we discussed this already, the way that he uses nature. I guess I was curious about, it seems like he's using nature here in the way that I understand it, like the natural world versus, I think at some point we were reading nature meant history.
Yes.
The natural world meant history, but it seems like he's a little bit more in touch with the way that we interpret nature.
Well, so he'll use it. Okay, so one of the themes that we're going to see in Hegel is that he's very much of his own moment. And in his own moment, this cosmopolitanism of the 18th century, of Kant's time, of the 1700s, really gave way to what we now call nationalism. And so I mentioned that there were national uprisings against Napoleonic rule, against the Napoleonic system. And Hegel saw that as not just, even though politically it did feed into the counter-revolution, it did feed into the restoration of monarchy and the defeat of Napoleon, and the restoration of monarchy even in France, but throughout Europe, it did seem to be part of the reaction against the French Revolution. Still, he thought it was part of the revolutionary process itself. And so that causes him to take up this idea that nations might be specific kind of vehicles for world spirit, for world history, that even in his own time, so not only in the past, but in the present. And that, there's a kind of peculiarity to that, meaning nature. So we could certainly say nature means history and society. It's everything that has come to be. It's everything that society has brought about, not just physical and biological nature. The reason it seems to be more primordial in Hegel is that he also includes culture.
Mm.
And in this respect, Hegel is a romantic. Like he is, his roommate was Holderlin, who's a famous romantic poet. He is dealing with romanticism in a way that Kant was not. And romanticism is very much about national cultures, spirit of peoples, in terms of cultural particularity, particular histories. So this is one of the things that, he is concerned with. What's the relation of particular history to universal history? And so in that way, it might seem to connotate as nature in that sense.
Mm.
What's natural to a people.
That's interesting context with the romanticism. That makes sense.
Yeah, but he still means like the history of a people. So it's really about particular history versus universal history. He realizes part of his understanding of the limits of the consciousness of the French Revolution was that they jumped to this kind of cosmopolitan level to the neglect of the spirit of particular peoples. Like that's how he understands the national, like, the famous painting of, Goya. Right, so we got the Goya painting. Hold on.
Yeah.
Is it the 5th of May? Hold on. If I'm able to... this famous painting. Francisco Goya. Let's see if I can get a good image of it. I hope I can get a good image of it. Oh, no, it's Pinterest. That's terrible. Sorry. Oh, yeah, we do have a Wikipedia version of it. Less vivid in color. That's fine. Right, so what is this depicting? This is depicting a popular uprising against Napoleonic rule. Right, and this is, Goya is associated with Romanticism. So in certain respects, of course, Goya is a counter-revolutionary. However, in another respect, of course, can we separate the what Hegel considered to be the awakening of the national spirit of peoples by the French Revolution, including the experience of being conquered by Napoleonic France, by revolutionary France. Right, it's all part of the same process. Rather than, one side is the side of cosmopolitan world revolutionary history, and the other side is like the counter-revolutionary reaction, the monarchists, the Catholics, right? No, Hegel wants a more overarching view of the opposing sides in this historical moment. What do they all contribute to? So I think that's also why I think that's why it might connotate at times nature.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's all from me.
Great. All right, let's take a short break. I know we've gone a little bit long, but let's take 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and return to the text. Okay, let's resume. All right. Jacqueline, did you want to say anything about the passages that you quoted?
Sure.
All right, let me pull up, share my screen. Okay.
Okay. So the one I have up top, that one kind of just felt like the overarching message for the beginning to middle part, if not the whole thing. Kind of him just putting into
into words what he believed to be the essence of freedom. And then kind of getting into that first paragraph there, it made me think of like the metaphysical aspect that we were talking about in the last lecture.
Mm-hmm.
And just the relationship between spirit and freedom and like individual level of consciousness in relationship to one's own being.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that stood out to me in that 21 section.
Mm-hmm. Let me say something about some precedents for Kant as well as for Hegel, and that's Descartes. So René Descartes, kind of infamous for his philosophy of two substances, but leaving that aside, there's the famous phrase, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, is the way it's usually rendered. Not very accurately, however. So it's not, I think, therefore I am, meaning I think myself into being or something like that. It's more like, what's the one thing that I cannot doubt? How do I overcome doubt, skepticism, really solipsism? So what's the one thing that I can't doubt? The one thing that I can't doubt is that I'm asking the question about what I can doubt and what I can't doubt. So that's really the point of like Descartes. And Descartes is foundational for Kant and also for Hegel in a way that might be confusing. But it is about what you call attention to here in this passage, autonomy. So self-consciousness. I think that Robert Pippin used this language in the reading that we did on the first day of class on critical theory, short essay, self-legislation. That we give ourselves the law. Now, of course, that's not really primarily an individual matter. But it also applies to individuals. It applies to what Kant said in What is Enlightenment? Dare to know. Dare to use your own reason. So, two things he says must be distinguished in consciousness. First, the fact that I know. Secondly, what I know. In self-consciousness, these are merged into one, for spirit knows itself. So, again, the subjective and the objective. So the objective would be what I know, and the subjective would be that I know. Self-consciousness, these are merged in one. Spirit knows itself. It involves an appreciation of its own nature, as also an energy enabling it to realize itself, to make itself actually that which it is potentially.
Which I think is kind of interesting, and I get to this later in my notes, but like the whole premise of, what ought to be, and then meanwhile he's talking about what it is potentially, and kind of like that tug of war is interesting. Also, obviously he's confident in this essay. He's coming at it at a confident lens, but I kind of glazed over this, but the essence of matter is gravity, and so then the essence of spirit is freedom. It's just he says it so point blank, and it's kind of like how in modern day we'll always be like, well, we know, if we know anything, like factually, if anything was to exist, we know gravity does, right? And so
we're not confident that freedom exists. Right? Yeah. Even though, from Hegel's perspective, we only know about gravity through our freedom.
Yeah.
Right? We've become much more pessimistic, and we lack confidence in our freedom, that's for sure.
And then the whole idea of the spirit versus, I didn't put it in my notes, but because it was kind of confusing to me, but the man's relationship with God, and how I think he views, I'm pretty certain he views the spirit different as God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, let's unpack that. So
okay.
So Kant famously has a piece called Religion Looked at from the Standpoint of Reason Alone. And I think that what Kant said about that was, we can't rationally prove the existence of God. The matter of the existence or non-existence of God is one of not reason but faith. So that would, kind of paradoxically or ambivalently make Kant either an atheist or a religious person.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly with Hegel. And so the way that I like to put this is, we need to know what the rational object of the concept of God is. Meaning, what does that word refer to? And if it refers to, a kind of, a being separate from us that somehow determines us in a traditional theological sense, then we might miss the point. So he really is, because he does do this in terms of his narrative of history. He does see Christianity as an essential component in the emergence of bourgeois consciousness. And the two phases of Christianity, or really three phases, like ancient Christianity, the Christianity of the ancient Mediterranean world, the Christianity of the Middle Ages, or the Germanic world, and then the Christianity of the modern bourgeois world, so the Protestant Reformation. So there's the early Christianity, there's the Christianity of the Catholic Church, then there's the Christianity of the Protestant Reformation. And in many respects, he thinks that Christianity overcame itself. It realized itself, but also abolished itself in bourgeois society. So it realized itself, it fulfilled itself, but in so doing, it overcame itself. So then the question is, well, then what happens to this idea of God from religion? It takes on a different philosophical meaning. And that's why Kant and Hegel, we can read them as Christian philosophers, but at the time they were seen as atheists. They were condemned by traditional religious people as atheists. Right, despite the fact that they use not only the word God, but they use a lot of Christian ideas. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, they were condemned by their contemporaries, by conservatives in their own time as atheists. So it's a curious thing. So we might say, spirit is in the place of God. Is history in the place of God? Is society in the place of God? We were talking earlier with Acacia about nature. So the anecdote that I like to use also, so the phrase, what's the rational object of the concept of God? That's what one always has to ask. Then my anecdote about this is, when I was raised Catholic and I was up for confirmation as a teenager, and I told the priest, I'm an atheist. And the priest said, well, what does that mean? What do you believe in? And does it, and I said, I believe in science, I believe in this, I believe in that. And he said, well, then you do believe in God. Because to not believe in God would mean to believe in nothing. It would mean a kind of nihilism. Mm-hmm. And so if you believe in anything, then you do believe in God, actually. And of course, this was a little bit of sophistry on the part of the priest. And I was sort of pissed off at the time. I was like, oh, this is just, bullshit. But sure. Looking back, I'm like, oh, actually, there's a point. Right? So, from a traditional religious standpoint, to be an atheist means being a nihilist. It means believing in nothing. And so insofar as one does, believe in these things, in truth, in the true, the good, and the beautiful, then of course this is, continuous with religion, with theology, because after all, that's where philosophy comes from. So also where science comes from. And it's where art comes from, of course. They all come from religion. But not unaltered. Not unaltered. So Hegel thinks that the Word had been... He uses this language in the reading that we did. The Word had become flesh. Meaning Christianity was realized in the world and therefore had transcended itself. And again, for traditional religious people at the time, this was blasphemy, this was heresy, this was atheism. But when we read it now, it's like, oh, he's justifying his philosophy with Christianity. And it's like, well, actually, no, what he's doing is he's appropriating Christianity to his philosophy. If that, I don't know if that helps clarify things.
That does. Yeah. Sorry, what did you say earlier? You said, what would be the...
Rational object of the concept of God.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Rational object. Okay.
Mm-hmm. In other words, traditional theology, as opposed to like folk theology, like it's not like a white bearded guy in the sky. That's not God.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So here's another way of putting it, because this is very much from the text also, from what Hegel says here, which is that religion in his instance, he's looking at the history of Christianity as leading up to bourgeois society in the modern world. Religion is reason. Religion is reason. Right? So we might have a kind of, religion is irrational, it's superstitious. Well, no, it's a prior form of reason. In other words, it was reason. So what does that mean? It means religion is the first consciousness of freedom. For Hegel. For Hegel, the first way that humans recognize their freedom is through religion. And indeed, religion is the first thing that humans invent that distinguish them from the animals. In other words, what humans have that animals don't have is religion. And the religious community is the first form of artificial society, we might say, or artificial community. Like, not the natural community, but the cultural community. That the first sort of human thing is religion. And for Hegel, that means that religion is the first form of freedom. It's the first form of freedom in substance, as well as in consciousness. So religion is the first way that we become conscious of our freedom, in both thinking and acting, in theory and practice. If we remember that religion is more a moral system. Like, we modern people think that religion is like a belief system. It's like what you think. It's like you can go to a bookstore and you can go to the religion section of the bookstore and you can decide whether you're a Buddhist or whether you're a Kabbalistic. Judaism is going to be what you believe in, But no, actually religion, like when religion really was religion, it was a whole moral universe that people lived in. It was a whole metaphysical cosmology. It was their social relations. It was everything. Religion was everything. It wasn't just a belief in your head. It wasn't just a way of thinking about things. So the fact that it's become that, right, that it's become like a belief now, shows that we've transcended it, in fact. And it's from Hegel's perspective, so I'm kind of channeling Hegel here. How does Hegel see religion? He sees religion as having become secularized. That's what Protestantism is. The fact that people no longer rely on the church to interpret religious truth. That's Protestantism. that you're not relying on the priestly caste to interpret scripture and tell you the truth of religion, but everyone has to do it for themselves. That's Protestantism. And in that way, it's the sort of end of religion. You know, that each person is meant to figure it out for themselves. Go ahead, Jacqueline.
And he believes that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, that's why for him, this is something that we'll get into tomorrow. We'll see that Hegel is taken up by Marx in a particular way. So Marx says the critique begins with the critique of religion. And Hegel has another way of putting it, which is that there are phases of the appearance of spirit. The first phase is religion, the second phase is art, and the third phase is philosophy. So the first way that spirit manifests itself is through religion, then it manifests as art, and finally it manifests as philosophy. And what he means by this is self-consciousness. So the first self-consciousness of spirit is religion. The second phase of the self-consciousness of spirit is art, and then the third phase of the self-consciousness of spirit is philosophy. And he thinks that, again, Kant and Hegel are like the beginning and completion of philosophy, meaning that only bourgeois society and consciousness is truly philosophical. You know, has fully transcended religion in this respect. But also, that means fully realized religion. He thinks. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression, but I think it's important.
Yeah. I guess we could skip to my last one. I want to come back to 25, but I feel like this kind of goes, it's like stringing along from what we were talking about, where kind of like what is a moral man, and he mentions a lot about like the different conquerors and kind of men that have been praised, you know, for like battle accomplishments and different things like that in history. And I was kind of confused by this, but also interested. I'm kind of like, I don't know, I just felt like, you know, quickly we shifted gears into talking about those different conquerors from history, and I was wondering if you like could draw that connection a bit more.
Right. So, yeah, historical figures. What we were talking about earlier, the fact that someone like Napoleon might have had his own psychological, personal motivations, but still played a historical role, still was a historical figure, still was, you know, in a sense greater than his own personal motivations in terms of his actions. I think that's, you know, again, the fact that great historical achievements have been made by people who we might consider to be personally, morally compromised, right? Or immoral even.
Yeah.
Right? That he wants to try to make sense of that, right? Because otherwise, you know, so I mentioned his romanticism. So let me emphasize this a little bit by way of example, or by way of illustration. So Beethoven, who's contemporary, he is very enthusiastic for Napoleon. He's very enthusiastic for the French Revolution. But when Napoleon crowns himself emperor, Beethoven, and not only Beethoven, a lot of people feel betrayed by Napoleon. So he dedicated one of his symphonies, I think it's the Heroic Symphony, to Napoleon. But when he heard that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, he scratched out the dedication, like, very angrily. Hegel wants to deal with that because there is a sense of disenchantment and disappointment among Hegel's own contemporaries with the French Revolution and its eventual outcome, the Napoleonic system, Napoleon himself, the Napoleonic Empire, the fall of Napoleon, the Restoration, the kind of conservative reaction. So political events really buffet his generation and produce a great deal of demoralization and disenchantment. And he wants to say, oh, wait, hold on, right? Like, just because we become disenchanted with these historical figures who seem to let us down at a moral level, that doesn't mean that we should not recognize progress in consciousness of freedom, spirit and reason in history, freedom in history. We shouldn't abandon that. We shouldn't doubt that just because of current events. And of course, that means looking back at history, right? It means looking at these historical figures and thinking about like the great men of history and what are they really, and what does it mean? That it's not a matter of a kind of biographical, personal, psychological, or even moral evaluation. It's really what they did and what made it possible for them to do what they do. All right, so I think that's really the issue. It's a very live issue for him and his generation.
Mm-hmm.
Is that there's a massive disenchantment with the political sphere. And there's a great deal of doubt that settles in, demoralization.
So the last line where he says, like, the demand in question assumes a lofty bearing and readily adopts a position not merely of discontent, but of open revolt against the actual condition of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Is he saying, like, people aren't, or amoral men aren't necessarily discontented by the world, but they're revolting for the sake of freedom or
Yes.
expressing freedom? Okay.
Yes. So if we go back to that reading from the first day of class, the Robert Pippin, it's really the status of the ought. It's the status of the ideal. Is the ideal merely an ideal? Is it like merely an ought? Or is there more to it than that? And that doesn't... So a very important part of the whole story that Hegel lays out here is how people struggle for freedom, often in a way where they're misrecognizing the actual content of their struggle.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that people could be motivated by misrecognition is important to him. So it's not just a mistake. It's actually an essential part of the story. That the result of history is to reveal that people were struggling for something other than what they thought they were struggling for.
Okay.
And indeed, often it's revealed that they were struggling for the very opposite of what they thought they were struggling for. Right, that's part of the story too, especially looking back on long history. So, ironic reversals of history are for him essential to the story of history. I think that he has a phrase. He says that a people nourish within them a virtue that becomes to them a poison and can only really be a virtue for the people who come after them. So people sort of destroy themselves through the virtues that they create that turn out to be the opposite of what they thought they were and are enjoyed truly as virtues only by their successors, historically. right? So, people will even adopt ideas, in a sense, in a way that's opposite to what the result of being motivated by those ideas.
Okay.
What actually results from it. So, I mean, which might seem kind of extreme, that he puts it just that way. Yet it is essential to it. Especially in hindsight. So in hindsight, in retrospect, so one way that this is the case is, again, the story of Christianity. So the Protestant Reformation was an attempt to overthrow the corruption of the church and reestablish ancient Christianity, apostolic Christianity, the Christianity of Jesus' apostles. And, it's really fundamentalist. Like, the Protestant Reformation is, like, very fundamentalist. And yet, the actual result of the Protestant Reformation is the secularization of the world. Like, the actual result of the Protestant Reformation is not the restoration of Christianity, but really kind of atheism. So, whatever Luther and Calvin might have been motivated by, the result of what they did was to produce the modern, secular, atheistic, bourgeois world. And yet that is their contribution to freedom. And that is part of the story of how spirit became conscious of itself, how freedom became conscious of itself, how reason moved the world. Because of course the Catholic Church was like, who are these crazy fundamentalist fanatics? The Protestants. They were like, this is kind of demented, this is kind of like crazed. Like, this is not like rational Christianity. It's messianic. The Protestants preached that the end of the world was coming. And the Catholic Church was like, wait a second. No, this is not what Christianity means. And yet, the Protestants really did overthrow the old church. But again, the end result was not a kind of fanatical fundamentalism, but a secular atheism. That was the ultimate result of all that. And that was, it's like over 100 years of war in Europe in which millions of people died. The Protestant Reformation was no joke. It was extremely bloody and violent. It was really a whole revolutionary era with a great deal of violence. And, the Catholic Church was just trying to maintain the kind of status quo of medieval Europe. And, of course, was trying to put down this crazy heresy before it unleashed these demons upon the world that led to millions of deaths and ultimately ended Christianity. Brought about the secular, atheistic world we live in now. Right. And indeed, I think the Counter-Reformation people, the Catholics of the time, were like, okay, you think you're going to restore Christianity, but what you're really going to do is destroy it. And of course, they were right. But they were also wrong. They were wrong because, we couldn't have stayed medieval forever, right? Like, progress had to happen, and this is the way it happened. At least that's what Hegel would tell us.
Okay.
And who was moral and who was amoral. Like the church was corrupt, of course. It was politically compromised. It served a rotten status quo. But maybe it was on the side of morality against the fanatical Protestants who were all about burning people at the stake, all that great stuff. The witch paranoia. Like, a lot of that happened in due to Protestantism. That's where the fear of witches really took off, was in that era. The fear of witchcraft.
The Protestants had that fear of the witches?
Yes.
Okay. In like colonial
in Europe. The of course, you know, the Pilgrims were crazy Protestants. That's why they were fleeing religious persecution in Europe, because they were fanatical Protestants. No, in Europe too, they did this, right? There was a lot of this. So that was, you know, we know it from American history, but it also happened in Europe. Yeah, there was a kind of social breakdown that's associated with the Protestant Reformation. You know, it really is. You know, there are many factors for it. There is a kind of disintegration of the medieval system that happens in the late Middle Ages. Adam Smith talked about this, and he talks about it very cursorily, but yeah, there was a breakdown of medieval Europe. I mean, there were also the plagues in the late Middle Ages. You know, there was all of that going on. And that created the conditions in which the power of the church was broken and in which this Protestantism could emerge. So that's just an example of a kind of irony of history, or what he calls the ruse of reason, the cunning of reason and the ruse of reason. Meaning the movement of reason in history sort of tricks us, deceives us in the moment.
That last one I have in the middle there,
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed this stanza. I thought,
Mm-hmm.
I think, like, if people read this or didn't read this, I think this is like something that's valuable to pull out. Like, just as artists and kind of the time we're in right now and relating it to that, just like what's an intrinsic desire to be interested in how we spend our days, and then how it's equated to labor or not labor. And I feel like right now it's what's in the zeitgeist is like your worth, your value isn't like depicted by the output necessarily that you're putting forth in the world right now. And so, yeah, I just thought this was pretty interesting, especially the part like where he goes, in the accomplishment of such designs, I must at the same time find my satisfaction, although the purpose for which I exert myself includes a complication of results, many of which have no interest to me. This is the absolute right of personal existence to find itself satisfied in its activity and labor. If men are to interest themselves for anything, they must have part of their existence involved in it, find their individuality gratified by its attainment. Basically, like saying that if people have no autonomy in what they're producing, they will have no value in it. Therefore, it's all kind of pointless.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So this is Hegel at his most bourgeois, meaning this is Hegel. You know, I mentioned that the Protestant work ethic. You know, the rights of labor. So John Locke, the idea that property is based on the rights of labor, not on the rights of conquest. So the way Marx puts it is that Hegel's metaphysics is a metaphysics of labor. Meaning, Hegel's known also for, although in the 20th century this is really misunderstood, it's botched, which is lordship and bondage, the so-called dialectic of lordship and bondage, or the master-slave dialectic. This is associated with Hegel and given a great prominence in 20th century interpretations of Hegel. But what people, and that's from the Phenomenology of Spirit, so not what we read, although written before what we read, so some of it is recapitulated here. But what people forget is that actually it's not a dialectic of master and slave, or of lord and bondsman, or lordship and bondage. It's really about the slave emancipating themselves, by recognizing themselves in their labor. And that once the slave recognizes themselves in their labor, then the master is nullified, is overthrown. Right, so it's really, and again, the notion of labor here is really artisanal labor, right? So it's not the sort of industrial labor that we think of when we think of labor, or it's not, what Marx is going to talk about in the reading for tomorrow, alienated labor, not in the same way. It's more self-externalization and self-objectification in and through laboring activity, production. So it's kind of like self-production through labor. That we recognize ourselves in our own activity through what we produce. And that goes not just for physical things, but intellectual things. And of course, art is an intellectual thing. Meaning it's something that affects the minds of others rather than, it affects their bodies, but it affects them experientially, not just physically. So it is, he considered art to be a geistic activity. He also considered politics to be a geistic activity. Meaning, what is a geistic activity or a spiritual activity? It's an activity in which we recognize our freedom. It's an activity through which we become conscious of our freedom. And certainly art for Hegel is especially an example of that. So, yes. And so he does think, like, for him, freedom and autonomy, self-determination, is freedom to labor, freedom in labor, freedom in one's activity. It's consciousness through labor, and meaning that we discover ourselves through our productive activity, and through our productive activity we actually become ourselves. We actually produce ourselves, and so that becomes really the self-consciousness of freedom. The self-consciousness of freedom is understood as the self-consciousness of labor. And in comparison to the world that came before, like the pre-bourgeois world, labor was not free. The peasants were serfs. Artisans were slaves of the guilds. So bourgeois society is about the emancipation of activity, of human activity in society. In all these domains. It's the breaking of traditional ways of doing all those things. And Hegel understands the consciousness of freedom in his own time to have been brought about through the emancipation of labor, through the autonomy, the personal autonomy that people achieve in their laboring activity, and in its recognition by society. That's the other thing. So in its self-recognition, but in its mutual recognition, in its social recognition. All right, so a lot of this, he's elaborating on things that we've read previously in Rousseau and Adam Smith and Kant. The public reason, private reason dialectic, that we're functioning as cogs in a machine, but we also reason beyond that, and that's because we reason in such a way that we could change the machinery, change the functioning of the cogs in the machine. And certainly Benjamin Constant, that we need civil liberty rather than merely political liberty because we need liberty in our productive activity, in our laboring activity in a commercial society. Right? We don't have time for politics the way the ancient peoples did. The ancient ruling class, the warrior caste did, because of course they did not labor, whereas we want the freedom to realize ourselves through our labor. It's very different. Aristotle thought that if you had to labor, you couldn't be free. And Hegel's very much aware of that. And so, rather, it's the opposite now, which is that we are free and conscious of our freedom in and through our labor. It's the opposite of Aristotle, who thought that if you have to labor, then you can't be free. And that's why only the patriarchal ruling class of citizens could be free, because they were in a position where others did the laboring for them. Hegel thinks it's the opposite. So Hegel, very bourgeois in this conception. And again, the conception of art, Jacqueline, that you raised art as an example of this, this would be a Renaissance conception of art. This would be a humanistic conception of art. You know, this would be very much about the creativity of the artist.
I'm assuming that I know when he says object, that's like conceptual.
Mm-hmm.
He's not necessarily talking about an artisanal object for himself personally. It would be more like the labor of his like intellect and his writings and stuff. That's what he means. Okay.
Yeah, it's something that we'll talk about tomorrow, or with the 1844 manuscripts in general, which is that objectification is a kind of self-externalization. So it's really, again, this dialectic of subject and object, where the subject externalizes itself in the object, so, and then can recognize itself through the object. So it's really objectification in a broad sense. It doesn't have to be a physical object. You know, because even the physical object in this sense is still like a spiritual object. You know, meaning what matters is not the physical thing, but the activity that produced it, and its value in society, and its circulation as a commodity, and how it's used, and, you know, again, as a social relation. So, again, we're dealing with the social relations and therefore the consciousness of labor, where what we strive for is for the mutual recognition of all of our activity in society. Physical, but also mental activity.
Sure.
Especially because, you know, we on the one hand have to have autonomy. On the other hand, none of us are truly independent. In other words, we're dependent on others. It's Rousseau on The Legislator, where he says, in exchange for our solitary existence, in which we are a whole entity, we sacrifice that in exchange for alien powers that we can only make use with other people in society. All right, this is very important to Hegel. Right, so we can only realize our personal autonomy in society as members of society. That's what he means by interest, by the way. Right, so interest, you know, it's what we were talking about also, the Mandeville, the fable of the bees, that a private vice can become a public benefit and a public virtue. That even when people are acting out of individual self-interest, they're also acting out of something beyond that. And they're contributing to something that transcends that. All right, it seems that we've come to time, or close to it. Any other thoughts before we adjourn? All right, so again tomorrow, and I'll send an announcement reminding, we will meet at 6:30. We'll just meet for an hour. We'll get into the Marx. We might have some aspects of the 1844 manuscripts left over to discuss on Thursday. But we'll meet from 6:30 to 7:30 tomorrow night. And so I will see you then.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Guys.
Bye. Thank you.